Hey, so I wanted to talk about Alfred Lord Tennyson. Tennyson, well, for better or for worse, is probably the most Victorian of the Victorians. In fact, you don't get any more Victorian than Tennyson unless you're Queen Victoria herself, right? I mean, that's just kind of what it comes down to. William Wordsworth, who of course is a Romantic poet, was the poet laureate of England. Now, Wordsworth, of course, as a Romantic, did most of his best work as a young man. They say poets are kind of like chess players that way, right? They basically do most of their great work when they're young. And indeed, for the last few decades of Wordsworth's life, um, he was basically out of sync with what was going on in the world of poetry and the world of Victorian England at large, right? And so when he finally passes away in 1850, right, dead center of the century, Alfred Lord Tennyson is made Poet Laureate of England. And it is, an appropriate symbolic move, right? Although maybe a couple decades late, in terms of moving the sensibility, at least in a public way, away from Romanticism into Victorianism. Now, in my handout on Victorianism, I talk a fair bit about Victorians. And I know that it's very popular to be critical of Victorians. And especially as we moved into the 20th century, kind of moved out of the 19th century into the 20th. A lot of writers at that time were very critical and wanted to move away from what came before. I mean, this is really common, of course. Each generation wants to do its own thing. And, Tennyson as a symbol of that, took a lot of heat. If you've ever read James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, there's a memory that the main character has, Stephen Douglas has, when he was sort of cornered by some of his classmates in school, asking him who he thought the greatest poet was. And he says Lord Byron, which makes them very mad. They think Tennyson is the best poet. And Stephen says, Tennyson, he's just a rhymester. A rhymester, somebody who rhymes words. He has no real sense of poetry. He gets beaten up for that. Can you imagine people getting beaten up over poetry nowadays? But the point, right, is that people kind of moved away from Tennyson pretty quickly and all that he stood for. But here we are, a long time since then, well over 100 some odd years, 170 some odd years plus since, Tennyson was made Poet Laureate. And I think that's a little unfair as we look back on Tennyson now to sort of pigeonhole him as just a rhymester. He had a lot more going on than that. Okay. Tennyson, I hope you read the biography of Tennyson, and you can read a lot about his life and career. Well, here's a few things that I want to point out about Tennyson. One of the things that we see is a movement away from Romanticism, which was all about the personal I, right, and the emotion that I experienced, right? Wordsworth was all about that. He talks about that in Preface to Lyrical Ballads, right? The idea of the pardon me, the emotions recollected in tranquility. But he's talking about the personal emotions, right? Whereas Tennyson takes a broader view of things, right? He takes, a bigger picture. He kind of steps back, and instead of looking at the individual, starts looking more broadly at ideas and things that affect many people. It's not a personal poetry, in other words, right? It's not a sense of here's what Alfred Lord Tennyson felt on this day at this time. Okay. He also is very much connected with the expansion of England in terms of the empire, the English Empire. And there's a sensibility that I think was pretty strongly felt in the 19th century under Victoria, of a connection to past empires, and particularly the Roman empire, singular, not plural, pardon me. And consequently also the classical literature from Greece and Rome, right? Which of course was largely avoided by the Romantics, right? There's the emphasis also on what I might call more traditional poetic conventions, rhyming being one of them, as Stephen Dedalus talked about, right? The rhymester. But it's not that phony, right? It's not rhyming moon and June and spoon all together and seeing what you can do. There's a lot more going on. So, for example, one of the two poems that we have on our syllabus, the first one is called The Lotus Eaters. Okay, and this takes on a passage from the Odyssey by Homer, right? A ancient Greek epic, right? In which the hero, Odysseus, or Ulysses as he's known in the Roman tradition, is trying to get his way back to Greece after the Trojan War is over. Okay, one of the episodes in that journey, right, is where he lands on an island where there is, quite frankly, some pretty significant drug abuse, right? The Lotus Eaters, right? And well, I can make a lot of jokes about this, the idea of the drugs. The lotus is basically a symbol for an attitude. But it's not a bad attitude. It's not an attitude that comes out of nowhere. Okay? They land on this island where there is this lotus, this flower. When you eat from this, right? When you eat from the fruit and flower of the lotus, you basically don't want to do anything. You are really stoned. I mean, you don't want to go anywhere. But there's an interesting angle to this. And it's an angle about life and what life is. These men, these sailors of Odysseus, right, have been at war for 10 years. They've been sailing for another 10 years to try to get home. Right? You think you've been caught in traffic. Oh my God. They just are tired. The hell with it. They don't just want to give it up. Tennyson does a great job of using the sounds of language to echo the sense of the meaning. He uses a lot of long vowel sounds and soft consonant sounds to create a sense of sleepiness, what I call a siesta, right? The idea of taking that afternoon nap. Well, in this place, it's always afternoon, right? As it says in line, what is that, line 4? In which it seemed always afternoon. Life is just some big, long siesta. You just want to go lie down and How attractive is that? Well, that's like very attractive, right? It's like those sailors from Mutiny on the Bounty who, overthrow the captain, right? And where do they wind up? They wind up in Tahiti. Oh my God, it's like paradise. Great weather. Nobody has to do any work. I mean, food's just right there. They just lie around. None of this, gotta do, work, right? Because the, Victorians, and we have a guy by the name of John Carlyle who talked about this. We do not read Carlyle because we just don't have time. But the Victorian or emphasis on work, right? What we sometimes refer to as the Puritan work ethic or the Protestant work ethic, right? The idea that, you need to always be working. Always be working. Always be doing something. Always be doing something with your hands, idle hands or the devil's workshop or whatever. They just want to give up. In the Bible, in the book of Genesis, right after the whole Adam and Eve eating the fruit kind of thing, right? Most people are pretty familiar with that story. But you may not be familiar with part of the end of that story. When Adam and Eve are cast out of Eden, one of the things that happens is God tells Adam that everything he needs, right, will come by the sweat of his brow. So food, you're going to have to work for your food now, right? In Eden, it was just right there for you, like in Tahiti. Now it's going to be something that you have to work for. And they are sick and tired of working. As it says in line 87, should life all labor be? Is that what life is about, right? You live to work or work to live? Probably heard that expression, right? Should life all labor be? It's a serious question, actually, even if it's told from a certain intoxicated frame of mind, right? The curse of Adam is that you will work. Nothing will come easy, right? You will work. The sweat of your brow, right? You'll be out there toiling and toiling and toiling, working. And that's what happens here. And these folks, they're done. Pay special attention to section 8, stanza 8. Things shift in stanza 8 pretty dramatically. Now, the next poem is called Ulysses. And Ulysses is, of course, as I said, the main character in the Odyssey. That's the Roman name. And while I don't think it was written precisely as a response to the Lotus Eaters, this is in many ways how I read it myself, as a response to the Lotus Eaters. Ulysses eventually makes it home, reunites with his wife and his son, kills all the suitors who have been trying to take away his land, his property, his woman, right? You know how in the fairy tales it always ends, and they lived happily ever after? Not so. This is Tennyson imagining what happens on the next day. What happens when Ulysses wakes up, he's finally achieved all this stuff, and now what does he have to do? Nothing. Become a king again, not in a great war, but just in a bureaucratic sort of way, passing laws and, making decisions about budgets and whose potholes are going to get filled up first and stuff like that. Boring. When you have led the life that Ulysses led in war, in travel, fending off gods, sleeping with goddesses, look it up. It's kind of hard to stick around the home and say, wow, this is great. Tuna casserole. Yeah. And instead, Ulysses wants to live more. Live more. Go out there and see the great unknown. He's like Captain Kirk. flying off into the unknown of space. This is the